Would you be able to send us the files?
Yeah, it'll go to workers. How is this?
No, mine.
Yours? It'll go to my media.
Okay. Let's go next.
Ready? Sure. All right.
Hey everybody, sorry for the delay. This is what we're going now. So, I'm John Harris. I think most of you know me. I'm the director of the Business Planning Program. In my mind, I'm trying not to step on this board, but it's my privilege to welcome you all to today's lecture. So this is a Coleman lecture series, and also co-sponsored by the Center for Peace and Development. All right, and the Center for Social Justice. The Coleman Lecture Series was established in 1998 to honor Professor Richard Coleman. The series allows us to bring distinguished speakers who are experts in their field to OU to have conversations with the wider campus. So our distinguished speaker is Andrew Greenlee today. Dr. Greenlee is an associate professor in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Dr. Greenlee's research lies at the intersection of housing policy, poverty, social equity within cities and regions. His current research examines neighborhood and metropolitan opportunity structures through residential mobility processes, the governance on spatial outcomes for public and subsidized housing participants, and the dynamics of neighborhood change driven by urban renewal processes of public housing transformation. Dr. Greenlee received his BA from Grinnell College, his master's in urban and regional planning from the University of Iowa, and a PhD in urban planning and policy from the University of Illinois at Chicago. Also, before we start, yesterday was Indigenous Peoples Day. Right? And so we as urban planners know that everything we do is connected to the land. And land is something that we can't disentangle from identity, from resources, from the future of people groups. So we like to make sure we acknowledge the indigenous ties to this land. So here in central Oklahoma, of course, the Hasinai Caddo Nation and the Kiri Kiri Wichita affiliated tribes were here long before the university. Of course, we know in the state of Oklahoma, 39 tribes are headquartered. And so regional and city planning, acknowledging those ties to the land and that nothing we do can separate land and identity. We, as a program, are committed to tribal sovereignty and working when we can with tribes to do the best for their communities. So without further ado, Dr. Greenlee, thank you so much for being here today. And we look forward to what you have to tell us. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, and it's my pleasure to be here this morning, to have the opportunity to speak. It's been a wonderful visit. This is my first time in Oklahoma, and I feel very welcomed and very much at home here, both on campus and beyond. So thank you all for those that have made this possible. Of course, especially the Division of Regional and City Planning, especially for the warm welcome. It's been wonderful to get to meet with you all, spend some time in classes together. Thanks to the Coleman Lecture Fund, the Center for Social Justice, and Center for Peace and Development for supporting this visit. So what I'd like to do today is just start by sharing a little bit about myself. One of the things that I find is that there's always a backstory to the research that we do and why we do it. And I think it's important to let you all in a little bit to some of the motivation for why I do the type of work that I do, but then also specifically some of the motivation, the way that connects to this particular project and story that I want to share with you all today. And then we'll explore some of the dimensions of the work itself and end with some implications for both policy and research. But first, just a bit about me. As John mentioned, my work is primarily centered in housing policy, especially on spatial dimensions of residential mobility, how people move, and both electively or under duress, being forced to move to change residences. My entree into this type of work began with me studying public and subsidized housing in the US, which for the past 60 years has been characterized by a series of transformations. Designed on one hand to provide safe, decent, and affordable housing to those in the most need, but on the other hand has also been used as a strategy to further goals related to spatial and socioeconomic integration, especially given that public housing has at times been historic sites for the concentration of low-income people. More recent transformations have focused on bringing the market and private capital into the provision of low-income housing. And part of my goal is to take a critical lens to that, to understand what the trade-offs are that we make as we bring the market into those spaces that in the past were really designed to be held off the market in order to ensure public benefit and public standards of care for the poorest amongst us. My works track mobility patterns in general, but it's also sought to really add depth to our understanding of mobility under recent transformative moments, including the nation's foreclosure crisis, public housing transformation, and more generally amidst increasingly diverse trajectories of neighborhood change. And so I guess to kind of sum that up, the main questions that I'm asking are, well, where do you live? And how does place then shape the chances that you have in your life? And then how even or uneven are then the distribution of those life chances vis-a-vis the support that you receive based upon the neighborhoods that you live in? Fundamentally, this means these questions really mean that I study neighborhood change through the changes that individual households make and try to understand consequences of government interventions and policies on these changes. And so the work I'm going to share today kind of gets at one specific aspect of this. We're going to be looking specifically at Chicago and neighborhood change throughout the city and the region, connecting this to broader questions related to social equity and inequality, and then towards the end, connecting this even to broader questions around things like social dimensions of health and well-being. So the motivation for the work today really comes from several places. First, from my academic examination of the ways in which spatial inequality has been produced through government and social action. But second, through the lens of my family's own migration and mobility history in Chicago. And so I'm going to link those two things together. I want to share a little bit of this motivation, and then we'll get into the nitty-gritty, the research side of things. So first, let's talk a little bit about the way that housers tend to kind of review and view the history around how systems of neighborhoods at times serve as supports, but also at times do society's dirty work based upon social aims and goals. And I think this quote from Ta-Nehisi Coates really sums it up well in a broader discussion of the kind of history of stratification and racialized inequality in the US. So for some of you who are in the class that I taught yesterday, we have just a little bit of a reprise of some of the things we were talking about yesterday. And so where I want to start with this is going back to some of the science behind neighborhood risk assessment and grading, what typically we talk about in terms of residential security maps, the famous redlining maps that many of us are familiar with. I think for most of us who work in housing and housing policy, when that's one of the things that really many people are aware of or connect to our work amongst the many things that we do. So in the 1930s, the Homeowners Loan Corporation residential security maps were designed to assess the relative risk of lending or guaranteeing mortgages with federal dollars in different neighborhoods. The idea here is that this process would assess the threat of infiltration of foreign-born, Negro, or lower-grade populations. So this is what becomes this notion of risk that filters into these federal maps and assessments of neighborhoods for the purposes of guaranteeing loans with federal dollars. And so clearly, looking at this today, we can see how this would be problematic. But I think it's important for us to kind of step back and think about the ways in which the science of the time was being applied in what was seemingly a logical and consistent way to develop these standards. I think the other important thing, though, to think about here is the conceptions of how neighborhood change here really connects with this notion of racial change and ethnic change. And the risk being that if we don't have kind of quote unquote harmonious separation of those groups, we run risks that spill over into things like the financial sector. So these ratings are developed based upon the social science of the time, produced by looking at changes in land values over historically. Of course, that social science did not set out to account for social drivers of these differences, but rather was pitched as a way of focusing on outcomes, right? A hierarchy of racialized risk that would allow for an understanding of which neighborhoods appreciated and which didn't. This dangerous social science, unfortunately, becomes naturalized within the logic of the restructuring of the US housing system in the wake of the Great Depression. And these observations underlie the logic behind those redlining maps, those residential security maps, again, which many of us are familiar with. So we can easily start to think about what some of the social processes are that might have undergirded the stratification that we see here that are not accounted for in the development of this typology. And of course, that's where the danger lies in then applying these to the systematic distribution or denial of capital to certain neighborhoods and communities. So when we take a look at this in Chicago, this is a series of overlaid series of residential security maps for Chicago. You see the different gradations play out in stark spatial relief. We have A areas described as those that are lendable, totally lendable, use of areas, no problem. We will gladly guarantee loans and loan restructuring here. Here are B areas within the region, C areas, and by this point, it's questionable whether these loans should be guaranteed. And then finally, the D areas, the ones that we're most familiar with. This is, the red ink gives us the name redlining. These are the areas that are not going to, these are unbankable, basically, in terms of providing aid in the wake of the Great Depression and the housing crisis in the 1930s. So that's context, right? Thinking about the ways that those standards that existed then kind of move forward in time and continue to influence the trajectories of neighborhood change, neighborhood well-being, neighborhood capitalization today. It's background to think about. April 11th, 1968, President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act. The act included a portion called the Fair Housing Act, which many of us are familiar with, which prohibits discrimination concerning sale, rental, and financing of housing. Initially, this act prohibited discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, and national origin, and later on, protections are added for discrimination on the basis of sex, disability, and familial status. Right. So we have these points in time where we have these kind of reckonings with some of that prior history, the guaranteeing of equal protection under the law. But I think one of the questions that comes up here, this is a question that's also raised in 1968 in a different report, is what repair actually might potentially look like in the moment amidst, right, the social questions that are being asked at the time. And I think a good example of this really comes from the most famous quote from the Kerner Commission report, the statement that our nation is moving towards two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal, right? Same time period. So years after the elimination of redlining practice, what keeps us apart? And what then are the consequences? Thinking about how we draw that today, I want to just quickly use a few excerpts and observations from the Kerner Commission report and then look at more contemporary data. So one of the observations in the Kerner Commission report was simply that housing is not affordable. Right? And I think many of us would kind of recognize today that affordability still remains a substantial challenge for us within our contemporary housing markets, especially the conversations we're having literally right now about affordability and accessibility of housing. And so what we're seeing here, right, in addition to this observation given in the evidence for the Kerner Commission report, is more contemporary evidence on housing affordability, splitting the nation's population into tranches based upon their level of income, and then saying what percentage of that population actually is paying more than an affordable share of their income towards rent. And so what we see is in the contemporary moment that for the extremely low income amongst us, almost 80% of them are paying more than a third of their income towards rent right now. A third for very low income. And then after that, it kind of falls off and more of us do have access to affordable housing. But for those with low income, this still remains a chronic issue. Another issue that comes up in 1968 that still sticks with us is bias and animus within the real estate markets. One of the things that Kerner brings up is the enduring power of animus caused by the steering of people of color into certain neighborhoods and away from others. And what we see from recent studies looking at both renters and owners is that explicit bias continues to be pervasive, with market actors serving as gatekeepers to opportune or disadvantaged places and steering us on the basis of our race towards certain places and away from others. Public housing was also seen as a potential strategy for lessening the yoke of racial and economic segregation. However, the politicization of the process of developing public housing, siting and location of that housing, meant that ultimately many urban public housing units ended up locating in neighborhoods that were already disadvantaged and already segregated. And so what Kerner is pointing out here is that we'd set a federal goal for 800,000 units. And at the time when Kerner is published, that's the gray line there, we hadn't yet reached it. We did reach that some years later, but then you start to see the trailing off in the housing stock, the loss of that stock due to structural issues with upkeep and maintenance. And there's a whole nother story there about the design and structure of our nation's public housing program in terms of how it's financed that helps to explain that peak and drop off from that continues to happen. So what we end up with then is this kind of history in which we're kind of coasting from this moment of racial recognition in the 1960s towards present, with some progress certainly made, but with lots of questions that still remain. And we can see these questions come up in the contemporary moment. More than 50 years after the signing of the Fair Housing Act, many US cities remain as segregated and sometimes more segregated than they were at the time that the act was signed. This great divide, the divide of people into neighborhoods with or without, still largely is happening on the basis of race and sets the backdrop for our conversation today. And I think, it's interesting to think about this. Sometimes when I give these types of talks, I describe this in terms of a tale of two cities. And, I think this, which I wish was Photoshopped, but it's not. These are simultaneous news headlines, shows us the reality of how different those cities can be within the same place. This is both in Chicago, where in one neighborhood we're contending with a massive amount of violence and gun violence. In another neighborhood, the big issue is that the place doesn't have the highest quality gelato, and residents are undertaking a public debate around whether that gelateria should be able to open up and exist there. So, this great divide to me leads to a series of questions that kind of underscores my work. But there's another piece to this that ultimately becomes more personal, and this comes through my own family's history, in this case with Chicago. So, welcome. This is my family. These are my grandparents and my aunts and uncles. There's my dad right there. My dad was born in 1935. They lived in a homestead in rural Mississippi. My grandfather was college educated and worked as a school principal, but ultimately found better work and pay as a carpenter. So left education, went into carpentry. During World War II, under the linchpin of segregation and racial terrorism and economic instability, my grandfather began to travel looking for work, moving to Alabama for a while, and ultimately making his way to Chicago as part of the war work effort. And the family soon joined him, leaving behind literally life on a farmstead. Apparently, my dad tells the story that when it was announced that they were going to leave to move to Chicago, he got his dog and ran away into the forest for as long as he could, to try to avoid having to leave and go to the big unknown of the city. And apparently tried to run away several times, but didn't work. After that, he was a lifelong Chicagoan. So the first place that my family moved in Chicago was a rooming house in what was called the city's Black Belt. This area received this name because it was one of the few portions of the city in which African Americans could move to and live. Given the pressures of the Great Migration, the area grew in population, but not in size, as a burgeoning Black metropolis was contained by both the rule of law and physical violence. And there's a map that I like to show. I don't know if anyone's familiar with the book, Making the Second Ghetto by Arnold Hirsch. But he shows, basically, he visualizes race riots in Chicago during this time period. And what you see around this one particular neighborhood is basically a map of that violence that literally is containing the African-American population in that neighborhood through the threat of, if you move out of this neighborhood, there is going to be a physical price to pay. My family moved to Chicago in the early 1940s. If we look back just a little bit before that at the residential security maps and the actual ratings that were given, we can see some of the interesting things that come up in evaluating that neighborhood. So here is the actual rater who is looking at that area that my dad's family moves into. Here's what they're writing about the nature of the neighborhood and the change that they see. This is from the late 1930s. These evaluations were from 1939. Right, and so I think it's interesting. Through this area, there are many vacant lots for which there's no market, due in part to the class of inhabitant and age of improvements. Rehabilitation is also a negligible factor, basically kind of throwing up their hands a little bit. Instead of demolishing or rehabbing some of these properties, it might be better to dispose of them than increase vacant property, which has little value today. You see this kind of fretting almost in the eyes of the residential security evaluator as they're looking at these spaces and kind of at a loss, right, for what to do and what problem solving might look like. Next up, in terms of my family's history, as my grandfather became more embedded in work as part of the war effort, the family was able to relocate to Altgeld Gardens, which at the time was a development designed to house war workers, especially those working in the industrial shipyards on the far south end of the city. At that time, my grandfather was, putting rivets in the ships that were going to be sent off to war. After the end of the war, this housing was converted into public housing, and that development actually remains occupied today after years of major rehab. So you can kind of see what it might have looked like when my dad was living there, and you can see the nature of that development today. And here's the residential security evaluation for that area. Streets are paved and unpaved, transportation fair, utilities are in. This area has a poor future and is not growing. Right? Again, this kind of fretting sense of what happens there. A final piece of history. So my family gained foothold in the local economy. They sought to buy property in the Inglewood neighborhood, which at the time was majority white. And as the first Black family on a white block, they faced the threat of physical violence. They and other families also experienced blockbusting, where real estate agents used the threat of racial change to encourage white families to sell their properties as quickly as possible, while then marking up prices for incoming Black families. During this time period, Chicago and many other cities transformed very rapidly. They hit peak population in the early 1950s and 1960s, and then seethed and churned as industry bought by the influx of migrants, and then emptied out, right, as suburbanization opened up opportunities for some to escape. And here, finally, you see the evaluation coming for that neighborhood in Inglewood. Something drastic ultimately must be done. This area should be rebuilt with better homes. There are numbers of them, cheap construction, which can easily be demolished. And ultimately, some of the first areas that my family lived in Inglewood was in fact demolished as part of urban renewal to make way for a new and modern regional mall in that area that lasted only a few years and then folded. So in the early 1940s, when my dad's family moved to Chicago, the city was still mostly white, with a few community areas reserved in which people of color could live. All right, and here's the map of that. These are cities' community areas. The yellow dots are those places where my dad's family moved across that trajectory. And then there's the racial makeup of the city. By the early 1980s, when I was born, the city was around a third each Black, Latino, and white. And there's little Andy there with my parents. This is accomplished as through this process of filling up, churning, and emptying out. And so the questions that I want to raise here today really kind of build upon the kind of overlaying of that social history that comes through the ways we've attempted to govern neighborhoods, and some of my family history and migration story, thinking about how we can overlay these things together to learn more about the nature of our neighborhoods and the nature of their potential to support and help and be generative moving forward into the future. So with that, I'll transition into talking about this kind of notion of the DNA of healthy neighborhoods. So let's talk a little bit more about neighborhoods change. As an urban planner, we're taught to measure neighborhood change and tend to do so by looking at changes between 2 points in time. There's a substantial discourse and debate around one particular trajectory of neighborhood change. And you might be able to guess what that is. People talk a lot about gentrification, right? One particular trajectory of change. But there's other trajectories that we need to pay attention to and to think about as being interdependent in order to understand our cities. And that's really what I want to help to describe today. So there's lots of kind of formal models out there where people kind of suggest what constitutes neighborhood change. And I want to kind of boil them down a little bit. There's a lot of things going on, but I want to think about what's really useful for us here today. Right, there's governing aspects that kind of contribute to it. There's economic aspects, there's social aspects. There's things that we can observe, like population moving, like physical change on the ground within neighborhoods, and demographic change that we can observe over time. But at the same time, this leads us to higher order understanding of spatial reorganization, social reorganization, and the types of political projects that are driving these changes. Now, typically when researchers set out to measure these types of changes, they're comparing 2 points in time and saying, well, you know, what happened in between time 0 and time 1? Who changed? what changed and how much change was there that was associated with that. The approach I'm taking here is a little bit different. It is certainly related. Rather than looking just at 2 points of time, I'm looking at multiple points of time together to form a kind of a sequence that allows us to understand some more things, more about where, how prevalent, and how consistent. What I'd say is how interdependent or how connected to other similar trajectories in other places. So the questions I want to bring to the fore today are three. Can neighborhood change trajectories rather than just comparison of one point in time to the other? Help us to contextualize the continued effects of segregation on the city. How do these dynamics help us to think about institutional and structural racism and the potential for us to intervene? And then finally, how can we assert health as a rationale and framework for intervention? What's the power that it gives us, especially as planners? Right? In some ways, I think this is kind of decidedly old school to return to some of the kind of health motivations and arguments within planning. So we talked a little bit about Chicago, and I don't want to belabor too many more points on the unevenness, the spatial unevenness and social unevenness of Chicago. But I think there is a little bit that's important to bring up here as we get into the actual empirical piece of this work. This map is showing Cook County, which Chicago is located in, and then DuPage County, which is immediately adjacent to it. And this work that's done by a series of economists, most people know Raj Chetty now, he's gotten quite famous for this kind of economics of opportunity work, is actually looking at individual earnings trajectories for young people and basically using kind of a dose response methodology to say for each year of exposure to each of these counties, how different is the income of that child once they grow up and later in life. And so what we see here is basically just a picture of unevenness, right? At the top of the list, we have DuPage County, which serves as a booster, right? In the nation, it's the county in which each year of exposure actually results in higher income for that child as they grow up. And then towards the bottom of the list, we have number 93, which is Cook County, which is where Chicago is located, which actually has a negative effect. So for each year of exposure, a child on average is likely to actually have a lower income in their adulthood. Right, of course, that also corresponds to other important social things. We already kind of said this in many ways, but Chicago remains a somewhat segregated city, actually a profoundly segregated city, around a third white and 2/3 people of color. While the region has a slightly different composition, more than half white and a little bit less than half people of color. Another few national kind of things that are important to contextualize here. One of the questions that a lot of us in housing and planning have had, and one of the kind of design approaches we've had to dealing with the lingering effects of segregation is that of mobility. Basically seeing if facilitating movement in between neighborhoods will result in more favorable neighborhood outcomes for low income and people of color who have been subject to highly segregated and low income spaces. Well, some of the trends that we see related to that are that at present, mobility rates are at an all-time low, as long as we've been measuring them from the late 1940s. The gap here is because a certain administration decided they didn't want to measure mobility rates anyway. So people are always asking, why is there the gap in breadth? It's more politics than anything else. But what we see is that just compared to the past, we're actually moving less. It might not seem like it. We hear stories about people moving all the time, but as a nation, we're actually moving less than we have in the past. Housing is the primary determinant of mobility. There's lots of reasons why people move, but housing consistently, that's the green bars here, remains the rationale for about 50% of the moves we make. And we compare that to jobs, or to other family circumstances or reasons to move. And the majority of moves that we make are indeed actually a short distance, right? Most of us, when we're making moves, are actually not moving too terribly far. So for me, this brings up questions. How can we start to connect trajectories of neighborhood change over time to the ways people move? So we can engage with this question of, is mobility a potential answer, right, for the continued impacts of highly segregated space and institutional racism? So to engage with this question, I'm actually using data from a company called InfoUSA. These are the folks that find you and send you junk mail. Okay? They still annoy the heck out of me. Their market is selling data to basically, I don't know, I get more junk mail than actually useful mail now. I don't know about anyone else. But they're the ones that find you, figure out your aggregate demographic characteristics, and then sell it to companies that want to send you junk mail. Right, but the interesting thing is they have really, really good information about where we live and okay information about our demographics, and they're tracking us over time. So by pulling together these records, we can get a longitudinal portrait of where households are living within the Chicago region. And that means we can also assess who's moving, who's not moving, and then we can connect that back to the neighborhood context within which they're living. And so that's what I do here as a way to allow us to understand how are these patterns of moving related to the ways that neighborhoods are changing over time. So in terms of mobility patterns within that InfoUSA data, I was able to find around 500,000 household moves between neighborhoods. In this case, what you see here in this visualization are moves from tracks to tracks. So the darker the line segment, the more moves we have in between one census tract to another. So we can start to define a kind of a complex network here of mobility in between places. The areas where we see the kind of darker patterns are primarily also where there's more people. That's the kind of urban core of Chicago. But then beyond that, we see still moves into and out of the city into the county. And so in this case, moves are normalized as the share of all moves from the same census tract. So we're looking at kind of proportions of moves. So that's one piece of what we'll talk about here. The next is the measurement of neighborhood change. So I said, traditionally, people measure neighborhood change as a function of from time 0 to time 1. And there's insight that we can certainly get from that. But my goal here was actually to look at a longer run sequence of change. So I'm looking at decade over decade change from 1970 all the way to 2010 as a sequence, right? So the unit of analysis becomes the sequence of change for each neighborhood, and not just what change happened between 1970 and 1980 or 1980 and 1990. And so for the most part, I'm using census data here with typical housing demographic factors that we use to measure neighborhood change. I cluster these together in order to identify 7 types of neighborhoods that exist within the city. And then based upon those types, I then sequence them into a 50-year history of neighborhood change. And so the sequence analysis, these are the same techniques that actually scientists use to sequence DNA, just applying it to social data. Lead us to understand these as single change trajectories for different types of neighborhoods, right? Neighborhoods are not staying the same, but they are in fact changing over time. And so then we can identify different types or trajectories of neighborhood change. And so I'll just give you an example of what this looks like longitudinally. I'm just gonna look at 2 of the trajectory classes that I identified. So we'll look at gentrifying, that's the one that we're all kind of familiar with, and persistently struggling neighborhoods. So neighborhoods that gentrified between 1970 and 2010 are now majority white, have a relatively high share of owner-occupied housing for central city neighborhoods and high rates of employment. Based upon my reading, most of these neighborhoods are more likely to be described as gentrified now as opposed to gentrifying, thinking about the trajectory over time towards 2010. By contrast, let's look at persistently struggling neighborhoods. The important things to point out here are the massive population loss seen in these neighborhoods since the 1970s, a cumulative loss of more than 500,000 people. These neighborhoods also experience persistently low income, high poverty rates, and are majority minority neighborhoods. Keep in mind, however, that race was actually not factored into how I identified these neighborhoods. I simply then overlaid it afterwards to see what's the racial composition based upon the other change factors. I don't want to essentialize that as a characteristic of why neighborhoods are changing. Otherwise, now we're doing Homer Hoyt's work in 100 years of land values again. That's not my work. So bringing these two things together, I bring together my mobility data with my neighborhood change data in order to actually look at what's the prevalence of moving in between these different neighborhood change trajectory types. Basically, can we start to figure out who might be moving ahead, or if there are any patterns associated with mobility and these neighborhood change trajectories. So rather than you all squinting and trying to figure out what's going on in this, and believe me, I spent many days doing that, I'll give you the big summary of what the takeaway is here. When households move, they tend to move between neighborhoods with similar change trajectories. So those are the thick arcs that we see in the circular visualization. What's maybe a little bit more hard to see in the diagram, and that's where me squinting comes in handy, is that there is a hierarchy of mobility flows that illustrate interdependence. You can see evidence of interdependence between gentrifying neighborhoods and working class neighborhoods, for instance. So we can start to see the push out of individuals from gentrifying neighborhoods into nearby working class neighborhoods. And likewise, we can see mobility between working class neighborhoods and older suburban neighborhoods as some of those individuals advance and are able to get ahead and kind of move around in this regional hierarchy of places. One of the other ways I took the mobility data to look at this was simply to cluster those patterns of mobility, right? The cluster the patterns of movement. And this helps us to literally actually see, in my opinion, segregation and social stratification in action. So looking here, this is a regional portrait, right? Again, here's Cook County, there's DuPage County, and these clusters represent areas where there's more people moving within those areas than there are moving between those areas. So we can literally start to see segregation kind of manifest. We start to see we have this kind of radial thing coming out of the center of Chicago. What happens then is we can start to attach demographic data to that and think about, well, is there segregation and what's going on here? And so what I've done is just color-coded high and low values for non-white poverty and income. And so we can see, for instance, cluster 6, right, is almost 80% non-white, has 25% poverty, highest poverty within the region, and you can see the median household income. My family has lived all our lives in cluster 6, right? All those trajectory spots that I pointed out to you before in my family's mobility history, the neighborhood I grew up in, is all contained within this. Right? It's almost a separate city in and of itself. Each of these is almost a separate city with regards to the power of mobility and migration for us to get ahead. There are consequences that come from this, right? And we can also see, before I move on, here's DuPage County again, that county that has the kind of boosting effect on income. We can see how that falls into a separate cluster that has, in fact, some of the most favorable conditions in the region. One of the things I've done here, and again, don't bother squinting, I'll kind of tell you what's going on here, was actually to pull in data that we're not typically looking at on the urban planning side of things, and that's actually health outcome data to understand some of what's going on. And so if I take these data and look at the neighborhoods that exist in cluster 6, what I've done is to color code these based upon their favorability, right? So everything, so a low life expectancy would show up red because we would probably all like to live longer. It's just an aggregate sign of the health, our health in the neighborhood. And high values then would fall in blue. And so again, looking at cluster 6, that cluster that all my family's Chicago history is in, you can see the prevalence of the red values there. Likewise, if we look at DuPage County, cluster 5, that kind of Booster County, it's not all, I mean, there's still some challenges there, but for the most part, we see very different circumstances with regards to health and well-being. And then likewise, the near north side of the city, this is the area that is predominantly what shows up as gentrifying or gentrified in that. We see some of the most favorable values overall. And so I think the important thing here is starting to think about the ways that this can help us to connect our understanding of both neighborhood change and mobility to a range of policy issues. And so as a way of ending, I just want to kind of give a few takeaways in that regard and also talk a little bit more about where I'm going with this type of work. So with regards to my first question, well, can neighborhood change trajectories help us to contextualize continuous effective segregation? My observations are that most movers are moving between neighborhoods that are experiencing similar change trajectories. They're not really actually, mobility is not actually changing what they're exposed to in terms of the neighborhood change trajectory. There's some evidence for a hierarchy of moves, for instance, gentrification leading to displacement, to more obsolescent neighborhood types. And in-movers into gentrified regions, for instance, have income distributions that are actually similar to the stayers, the people that are not moving during the study period, which kind of makes sense given the logic of gentrification and that displacement effect. So by using these residential mobility information, we can start to see these processes at a really granular level and kind of understand what some of the causes and consequences might be a little bit differently. How do these dynamics help us think about institutional and structural racism and the potential to intervene? Well, I think the insight that comes from those mobility clusters helps us to understand the kind of ways in which residential segregation and differentiated opportunity actually exists, right? Even as people are moving, they're tending to stay within those clusters. I think there's a broader question here that's much harder to answer. And that's really, to what extent is this an expression of choice versus structure? Are these simply preferences and people are moving to places that they would really like to live? Or are there bigger structural determinants that are truncating the set of choices that they have available to them, resulting in them basically staying within these same clusters over time? These patterns also overlay with those historical assessments of economic and financial risk, which can help to explain contemporary patterns of growth and disinvestment. So the history matters, right? The ways that those neighborhoods were either systematically given advantage or disadvantage, I think matter for the patterns that we see today. And that's a simple finding, but I think it's still really insightful for us to think about as we're crafting policy to address the issues that result from the persistence of those patterns. How can we assert health as a rationale and framework for intervention? I think mobility can help to define multiple cities within one. And each of these cities might benefit from different governance approaches to things like housing, health, and well-being. And so I think there's a really interesting opportunity here to think about kind of more customized and targeted approaches that engage these places as having very different trajectories, different capacities, and different histories related to the ways that they've changed over time, the ways that people move within and outside of them. the mobility clusters can help us to understand the costs also of segregation, not just at one point of time, but also the persistence of the cost over time. And I think his arguments kind of evolve around healthcare and the relationship between healthcare and place. I think, especially the last few years, we've had a more visible and involved conversation around that, especially due to the COVID pandemic. I think that this type of mobility information can help to remind us what we're looking at when we're talking about investments. Oftentimes we're talking about investing in people and their health, but I think we also need to talk about investing in place as well. So an example of how we're leveraging this type of work right now is this. I'm working with Henry Ford Health, which is the largest healthcare system in the Detroit area, to actually connect patterns of neighborhood change in that region to the health histories of individuals. So Henry Ford Health, of course, has health records. I have neighborhood change records. We're bringing those things together. But the thing we're really interested in here is not just the health, in this case, of mothers, but we're also looking at the potential to determine intergenerational effects of chronic deprivation, stress coming from the neighborhoods that people have lived in on next generation. So looking at their children. And so this is a project that's we're kind of actively in right now. We're doing our first recruitment and sample, collecting residential history, location histories, connecting that to my analyses, and then also connecting that to the biomedical records that the health system has to actually try to demonstrate that segregated, disadvantaged neighborhoods actually are likely to have an effect on the long run health of the next generation of children. And so to me, this is really exciting, not only in that it's insightful for public health and healthcare, but I think it also, for us in planning, helps us to look at new rationales for thinking about what health, safety, and welfare might mean, and what types of investments we feel empowered to call for in place now to deal with issues that might hopefully intervene in intergenerational cycles of disadvantage at the level of our bodies and our healthcare. Basically looking to think about how do we create collective interventions that then help deal with these issues that we tend to think about as individual health problems, or that we might think about as collective health disparities. So the takeaways for policy here. Mobility has been called up as this potential panacea for segregation and related disparities. And my response to that is it certainly has potential to be, but not always, especially for the disadvantaged. My approach to clusters here require different resources, right? These might not line up with administrative boundaries or with the traditional ways that we intervene and distribute resources. We're going to need to be thinking differently about regions and the spaces of intervention. I think within this work, there's also this potential to address policy's Goldilocks challenge. If we come up with policy that's too broad, oftentimes then it's simply unresponsive to local needs and populations. If we come up with policy that's too narrow, it's oftentimes ineffective to reach beyond particular geographies or populations. But my hope is that this can help us to get things just right, to effectively deal with dynamics about where and whom with regards to the type of policy making and problem solving that we're doing to address issues related to segregation, but also to racialized disparities that exist across a range of issues. So to end, I just want to take a step back. We've been in the data, we've been in this type of information. I want to take a step back to kind of update a little bit on the trajectories of those places that my family has lived over time. What's the current debate? For instance, in Bronzeville, right? We saw that fretting, right, from the residential security evaluator about that space. Right now, it's being hailed as, it's kind of being rediscovered as a new and rebranded as part of a new Black Mecca for the city with quite a bit of reinvestment and development happening. I'm not saying that's good or bad. I'm just kind of describing what's happening in that space right now. Down on the far south side of the city in Oakville Gardens, the city is planning the largest expansion of the L system, the heavy rail system, in the CTA's history that would extend the red line from 95th Street, where it ends now, down to 130th Street, which is basically right adjacent to Oakville Gardens, that public housing complex. I've actually been involved in this project for now almost 15 years, looking and helping to advocate for a community preferred route for that extension that hits the locations that community members feel would have the most beneficial impact while minimizing the effect of that right-of-way that's going to have to be carved through their community in order to create the extension. And we actually, from that work, the community preferred route actually was the one that the city adopted for the red line extension. You kind of see the cartoon map of that there. But there's, of course, then a lot of questions. This is one of the city's last and final reserves of truly affordable housing. And clearly, this major transit improvement is actually going to shave about an hour off of the commute time from someone who's living in this area to the downtown area, right? But that also means that new investment is going to happen. But the question becomes, will this remain an area that is affordable for the residents that currently live there? In Inglewood, there's a mixed bag. Inglewood a few years ago was touted as being one of a food desert that got a Whole Foods. That Whole Foods has closed. But now we have other organizations that are pushing at a local scale in order to eliminate the food desert that exists there. So these are not uncommon stories, but I think they help to just kind of characterize some of these trajectories of change as they exist now. And in the neighborhood that I grew up in, Hyde Park, they're moving forward with the Obama Library. And there's been a lot of controversy around this due to provisions that have called for Chicago's parks to be free and clear, forever free and clear. This would be built in the middle of Jackson Park, which is one of those historic parks. And so there's a lot of debate around not just what does that look like, but more so, what do community benefits look like as in response to this major new focal point coming into that area. So again, I hope this has given you just a little glance into this work. My goal here is twofold. One, it's to get us to kind of think about develop a new language for thinking about those historical facts that we understand about the way we've intervened in the past, continue to spill over into our policy and the circumstances that we see on the ground today. But more so, it's really to help us to think about what are the new terrains and the new ways that we can muster arguments to fight, to craft more intentional and better policy, and hopefully intervene to break down these structures once and for all. So with that, thank you all very much for the time, and I would look forward to taking any questions in there. Andy, Professor Lee.
Your talk, I think it's a nice way to emphasize what we're actually all of our guests we've heard, and I assure you that adding the health part is how, as much as we try to push for mobility, it's really hard. And part of it is the benefits, right? People trying to keep those social networks. And so in a way, it makes sense that your work is showing that before perhaps these negative health outcomes. And so I really appreciate your project. I had like a really minor question, so I don't know if you got into this part, but like some of my work is trying to also balance structure and choice too, where people live. Did you find any, for those that were able to move in the higher neighborhoods, were there any able to see if there were improved health outcomes, or kind of too micro? So
So I think it's too micro for much of what I presented here today. I think that will come up with this Henry Ford project because we'll have this literally at the level of individuals. And beyond that, we're, in addition to surveying them, we're interviewing them. So not only are we looking to kind of just look at health data and look at medical records to come up with our own narration of what happened, but we're also interviewing them and talking with them and kind of working through those histories to understand why each of those moves mattered and how it relates back to their sense of their health and well-being, what they saw as the stressors that existed when they lived in those places. And so I think my hope is that we're getting towards being able to kind of answer that question. So I agree. The real challenge here is that I don't want to overread. I don't want to overfit a structural argument to what's going on here. And I don't want to also remove the agency of individuals for choices that are made. So that's one of the reasons I've been so excited about this partnership, is that it allows us to get some more nuance and more of an understanding about qualitatively about why moves matter or not for people's well-being, and then connect that back to health and start to see if there are patterns. So, time.
The clusters and sort of how the edges of those clusters happen, based on where the groups actually, right? Are you trying to overlay any other boundaries on top of that to see what's going on? I was thinking of school districts or after you brought up red lines, it's like,
That's a good question. I think so. For me, the first thing that I saw was, wow, this really is not being defined by municipal boundaries, which at least for Chicago is also one school district, one mega school district. It's surrounded by a lot of little ones around the edges. Chicago is always tough because we have a really high share of local governments. So interpreting like what is mattering here. So I think for me, the biggest takeaway is that those boundaries actually didn't seem to define well what the kind of the edges of mobility there. It seemed actually to correspond more to race and income than to the actual administrative boundaries. And for me, that was the point of saying, well, I think we need to think about, is the correct scale of intervention that of local government if these issues and the ways people are moving within these systems are kind of flowing really freely between these municipal boundaries. So yeah, which I think I agree. I think there's a lot more to do there to say like what fits the best or what might help to explain this if we kind of overlay it. But my first takeaway is, well, it doesn't seem to fit any kind of existing boundary or structure that I would expect it to. Any questions? Yes.
Is there any correlation between where the university built noise is and the dormitories versus where housing is in
Absolutely. So especially in the case of University of Illinois at Chicago, there's been a lot of work over the past 15 years or so on the university as an urban developer. And so one example of this is that right along the edge of the University of Illinois Chicago campus used to be actually a series of public housing developments. And all of those in the late 90s were basically demolished, and the area was redeveloped as something called University Village. University Village was pitched as being kind of a mixed income. This wasn't done through the CHA plan for transformation, so it wasn't necessarily mixed income at the scale of like public housing residents, but it was pitched as kind of a live workspace, university faculty, grad students, and the general public living in part of this university community. And then when the price points came out for the units, it was not for university faculty and certainly not for grad students. It was far more expensive. And so that area has really, through a lot of the advocacy of that university, changed in a way that has removed the low-income residents who were adjacent and is now not even affordable to university faculty to live by. So that's not an atypical story. But that's kind of some of the dynamics of what's happened around there. It's not that similar or not that dissimilar for University of Chicago, kind of Hyde Park, where I grew up. The dynamics there are still, though, a little bit more. You have Hyde Park that is kind of mixed income and mixed race, and there's still a lot of vacant land and very different demographic circumstances surrounding that area. But University of Chicago, at the same time, has worked in interesting ways to kind of protect and create a cantonment area around its space, including it's one of the few private universities in the country that has its own police force, not a security force, but a sworn police force that carry guns, have arrest powers, and the ability to basically act as law enforcement officers. And that was negotiated with the city. I think it was during the 50s or 60s, the university threatened to move itself to the suburbs because of what it saw as the change that was going on around the neighborhood. And so that was part of the negotiation that they made in order to stay in Hyde Park, stay in the city. So universities as urban developers and as their own kind of government entities become really important for us to think about in relationship to neighborhood change and neighborhood stability. Sorry, that was probably more than. Yeah.
So my students are here. Whether pieces of data you just couldn't find out what you had, or issues you came across in terms of finding spatially.
Absolutely. Thank you. Absolutely. I mean, as you might imagine, this was a pretty complicated project. The mobility data, I had 13 million some records. So trying to figure out how do you start to represent that spatially was a big challenge. You saw that kind of network map that I came up with. Most of the GIS work, well, all the GIS work I did here, actually I did in R studio. Which was a learning process for me. I had to kind of learn how to do that, and now I use that a bit more frequently. So I think it's useful for research workflows because it allows you to keep the data all in one, basically all in one program. It's reproducible. So I use that pretty much exclusively now for my research work. I don't know that. Depending upon what you're doing in a practice setting, it may or may not be useful to take the time to do it that way. So the big things that I used were a lot of kind of database tools in order to organize the information. R then allowed me to kind of aggregate and in ways that would then allow me to visualize it well. The big challenge here was getting the mobility data. Took several tries at bank proposals to be able to get enough of the data to actually say something, and data has become more expensive, so I can't update it without so much larger funding. My goal is that eventually some data that's like that could be available for planners to use on a more regular basis. So I think there is a lot of insight that comes from that. The ACS data and census data that I used was primarily the Brown longitudinal tract database. So that's like readily available and out there. And I'm just waiting for them to update once we get our finalized 2020 numbers, our tables released and disclosed. What is that? Maybe April, May 2023, to do some more updates with that. So I guess the big takeaways for me are databases are your friend. And it is useful to invest in, at least understanding enough to be able to use them. Spatial joins are your friend, very much so, in helping to aggregate information to useful levels and levels that you can then represent for others to see. And I think the other thing, and maybe I didn't do the best job of it here, but keeping it simple and intuitive is, I think, also really important, especially when you're starting to overlay these really complex layers together that are going to be challenging for people to kind of, people are used to, I think, thinking about these things in terms of their experience at the neighborhood level or their experience at the level of local government. When you start to try to describe them as a regional system, sometimes it's easy to lose people. And so I think trying to be as simple as possible with some of those things helps. So hopefully that's useful for thinking about approaches here. Thank you for that. I've just started to teach some of this. I'm developing a new class on neighborhood analysis, and we're not doing that, but integrating some of the kind of steps and processes into it, and it's a steep learning curve for everyone. Yeah.
I have a question about the charge one, the circle one.
Oh, sure.
That's one I know. Software you use.
Yeah. So this is the Circleize package. So it's basically a ggplot, but it organizes itself into this kind of this chord diagram, and the package is called Circleize. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this one is a little complicated, but these are really nice when you have flows with lots of small proportions to describe. Yeah.
I think a lot of aspiring planners are really interested in how do we accomplish the kind of development that cities as entities generally like to see without positive land displacement. So I'm interested in your study of Chicago specifically. Are there any neighborhoods that you've seen that, I don't know how they agree on that, but that have seen outside investment coming into commercial activity, residential opportunities, all the good stuff that economic knowledge that maybe historically would struggle, and that also managed not to see their historic residents displaced.
I think, some good examples, and there's no perfect example, right? A good example that comes to mind is the Logan Square neighborhood. And what they've had is a really strong neighborhood association. So that has pretty high capacity for advocacy. And one of the strategies that they used was actually historic preservation. So they actually helped put in an application to the National Register of Historic Places for a public housing development at a time period leading up to kind of the city having its eye on redeveloping that area and transforming it. And so what that application was approved. And so what that did was that it kind of preemptively actually created red tape that meant that development had to conform to a whole different set of rules and regulations that preserved the public housing site itself. And so it ended up they ended up doing some redevelopment on and around that site, but it had to be done in a way that protected and reinvested in the public housing units rather than simply going for the typical strategy, which would be demolish and then do a public-private partnership to redevelop there. So I think that was pretty ingenious in terms of thinking about how do you protect the physical housing stock that's there and that is designed to remain affordable, and while at the same time then allowing complementary development to happen around it. again, there's no, I think, perfect solution, but I really like that example. That really came from, I think, some creative thinking about what could actually take this outside of, or what could create an argument that would trump in some ways other development logics and arguments that would be applied to that space.
We have come to the end of our time. Before we thank Dr. Greenlee, we need to have one students. SBA is hosting a pizza party upstairs in 3:45. And you get a chance to talk a little bit more. So we can keep this conversation going. So that's 3:45 right after here. Second, these topics are interesting. These courses in the spring. We have a sociology housing course. We have a community development course. Planning with diverse communities, courses focused on the harm of reduction, essentially. For instance, the planning policy. So they need all these big issues. For now, let's thank Dr. Greenlee for.
My pleasure, and I want to zoom into some of these courses. Thank you all so much.